Good morning, you're watching A News. I'm Dilek Tuna. Here are the top stories. Markets bounce back in relief rally after US President Trump announces a 90-day pause on most new tariffs. US President Donald Trump warns military action against Iran still on the table ahead of nuclear talks. Panama says after talks that the US recognises Panama's sovereignty over the Canal. Markets react as US President Donald Trump hits a pause on his sweeping tariffs, except when it comes to China. With a 90-day freeze announced and a baseline 10% tariff remaining, Washington signals a shift in strategy amid growing trade tensions. Our correspondent in Washington, Ubay Shahbandar, has the latest.
Stay calm and carry on. That was the message from President Trump on Wednesday morning as he sought to address market concerns now that his sweeping historical tariffs have come into full effect. Trump announced that he will issue a 90-day pause on all tariffs while keeping a baseline 10% tariff across the board, with one notable exception: China. The president said that he is singling out China because of its retaliatory tariffs, while other countries are, according to the president, telling the president that they are willing to negotiate a trade deal. Everything is going to work out well, the president wrote on social media. The USA will be bigger and better than ever before, according to the president. President Trump also wrote that now is a great time to buy and for companies to move their operations into the United States in order to avoid having their goods taxed by American tariffs. The U.S. stock market has rebounded a bit as Wall Street assesses the prospects for a trade war after China hit back with an 84% tariff of its own on U.S. goods. The U.S. now has a total tariff of 125% on Chinese imports. White House economic advisors have said that Trump's tariffs have given Washington significant leverage in reaching more equitable agreements with countries that have a high trading volume with the United States. Traders on Wall Street may have been further reassured that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that he would be taking a lead negotiating role in tariff talks. Meanwhile, President Trump has said that negotiations with countries that have requested meetings will take place immediately, and that seems to have led to Wall Street stocks surging as a result. Nonetheless, Trump has made it clear that he's more concerned with protecting working-class Americans as opposed to prioritizing Wall Street, the latter of which has been generally in opposition to expansive tariffs. I'm Ubay Shahbandar for A News, Washington, D.C.
Wall Street posted its biggest gain since 2008 after US President Trump announced a 90-day pause on most new tariffs. The move also sparked a rebound across global markets, despite rising trade tensions with China.
US financial markets roared back to life after Wall Street's worst four-day stretch since the pandemic. The S&P 500, a key index that tracks the performance of 500 major American companies, jumped nearly 10%, its biggest daily gain since the 2008 financial crisis. The Dow Jones rose by almost 3,000 points, while the tech-navy Nasdaq soared more than 12%. The surge came after US President Donald Trump announced a sudden 90-day pause on most new tariffs, easing fears that his trade policies could trigger a global economic slowdown. While a blanket 10% tax hike on nearly all US imports remains in place, the more aggressive duties on dozens of countries have been paused. However, tensions with China escalated, with Trump imposing a new 125% tariff on Chinese imports, retaliation for Beijing's own 84% tariff on American goods set to begin Thursday.
If nothing changes, 125% tariffs on Chinese exports to the U.S. is immense. We import a massive amount, hundreds of billions of dollars from China. That will have to go somewhere else. I think it's going to rapidly change supply chains for companies who now operate heavily in China. That's already been happening the last few years. the seeds were sown for a lot of movement for companies like Apple and Nike and many others to shift to countries like Vietnam and India and other South Asian countries where production costs are obviously lower than they would be in the US, which is why the reciprocal tariffs were so damaging, is because the scope was so broad. There was really nowhere to hide.
Even with the sharp gains, US markets remain below levels seen before Trump's original tariff announcement on the 2nd of April. But the president's reversal was enough to lift investor sentiment and prompt financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs to roll back recession forecasts. The US Treasury also successfully auctioned $39 billion in 10-year bonds.
We saw a bit of a sell-off in bonds overnight that drove yields up sharply, where we saw the 10-year Treasury yield go up over 4.5. Now, I'm going to say that's important because things like car loans and mortgages are benchmarked off the 10-year Treasury. So that means if that yield is going up substantially, you're going to pay more for cars and mortgages. That's not good, right? The question is, what's going on? The volume of trading. Was this China dumping some of the assets that they hold, or was there something else going on? Well, the good news is we had an auction from the Treasury today at 1 o'clock. There was very strong demand for that same 10-year Treasury bond, which means there's no issue. People still have a lot of faith in the credit worthiness of the United States.
In response, China filed a new complaint with the World Trade Organization, accusing Washington of unilateral bullying and vowing to defend its economic interests under international trade rules. Despite the ongoing tensions, Chinese markets opened higher. The Shanghai Composite rose 1.3%, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index gained 3%. Still, concerns lingered as China's yuan weakened to its lowest level since 2007. That rebound in sentiment extended across the Asia-Pacific region. Japan's Nikkei 225 surged 8.6%, Taiwan's TAIEX jumped 9.3%, and South Korea's Kospi climbed 4.8%, all reflecting relief over the temporary pause in tariff escalation.
Some Americans, however, remain concerned about the future, regardless of the pause on tax hikes.
Some Americans are tightening their belts ahead of higher prices when they shop. It's after US President Donald Trump's recent tariff, increases on imports and a sudden pause of the tax hikes on Wednesday. However, some residents are still worried about the future.
Trump is full of himself. He wants to make the rules. 90 days, not gonna make a difference to me. I don't even fit in that pay grade.
So I'm the guy that I adjust to every situation. I just went and got an extra job because I know I'm gonna need it. You know, if the tariffs go up, I just got to get extra. I got to adjust to whatever's going on in the world. So I'm an adjuster. You know what I'm saying? So I would just get an extra job. I already got it. You know what I'm saying? Because I know the tariffs, and I know that guess what? We're gonna need extra money.
Trump is not the first person to implement tariffs. You know, it's like when they say, like, Obama did more drone strikes than any other president, you know? Nobody got mad. That's what the job requires, so I'm not mad at it.
The 90-day pause on tariffs brings some relief to consumers and investors worried about the global economic impact of US trade policies. However, uncertainty still hangs over everyday Americans.
67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad.
Earlier, China announced it's raising tariffs on US goods to 84% starting Thursday, following US President Donald Trump's levy hike that brought the total tariff rate on Chinese goods to 104%. Our Mahnoor Maktoum has more on the latest trade war escalation.
The United States has further escalated the trade conflict with China by imposing a 104% tariff on Chinese imports. In a recent development, China's finance ministry announced an 84% tariff on U.S. goods starting Thursday, up from the 34% previously announced. Chinese government's response to these tariffs has been strong-worded, with officials calling these measures unilateral and protectionist.
China firmly opposes and absolutely rejects such domineering and bullying behaviour. If the United States truly wants to resolve issues through dialogue and negotiation, it should adopt an attitude of equality, respect, and reciprocity. If the United States ignores the interests of both countries and the international community and insists on waging a tariff war and a trade war, China will fight to the end.
And in response to these intensifying trade barriers, major Chinese brokerage firms, including CITIC Securities and Orient Securities, have announced their commitment to support the domestic financial market. Moreover, more than 100 Chinese companies have announced a share buyback program in an effort to boost investor confidence amid the growing market uncertainty. On the stock market front, the Chinese stock prices have seen an initial dip. However, efforts by brokerages and corporations to stabilize the market may prevent further decline. These developments highlight the deteriorating relationship between US and China. It also raises concern about the economic impact both globally and within the two nations. Manu Maktoum, A News, Beijing, China.
Leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean call for stronger unity and criticised US trade policies. It follows US President Donald Trump's temporary easing of tariffs on dozens of countries. They gathered in Honduras on Wednesday for the 9th summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva urged nations to redefine their place in a changing global order, warning that trade wars have no winners. Honduran President Xiomara Castro accused Washington of redrawing the economic map without considering others. European Union member states have approved a 25% tariff on a wide range of American goods in response to Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from the EU. The first out of 3 rounds of tariffs is set to take effect on the 15th of April.
Member states of the European Union have voted to approve imposing a 25% tariff on US exported products to the EU in retaliation for the Trump administration's announcement to levy tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from the EU. All member states, with the exception of Hungary, voted in favour of the retaliatory tariffs, which will cover a wide range of US products, including tobacco, poultry, soybeans, steel and aluminium. The European Union will apply these tariffs in 3 rounds, with the first set to enter into force on the 15th of April, the second phase to kick in from mid-May, and a final round to follow in December. These are Europe's first retaliatory measures in the trade war waged by Donald Trump against his trading partners across the globe. The retaliatory duties on US goods are worth nearly 22 billion euros.
Just days before expected nuclear talks, US President Donald Trump has warned that military action against Iran remains on the table. He added that Israel will be the leader of any operation. However, Iran says it's open to negotiations.
US President Donald Trump says he hasn't ruled out military action as an option against Iran. His comment comes just days ahead of anticipated nuclear talks between the two nations on Saturday in Oman. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Trump said Israel would be the leader of any military strike if Tehran refuses to abandon its nuclear weapons ambitions.
But with Iran, if it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. He'll be the leader of that. But nobody leads us. We do what we want to do.
While Trump earlier characterized the talks as direct, Iran has insisted that any engagement will be indirect. The United States is increasingly alarmed by Iran's progress, with officials saying Tehran is closer than ever to developing a viable nuclear weapon. The US Treasury Department has imposed a new round of sanctions targeting Iran's nuclear program. These include 5 entities and 1 individual for their roles in supporting nuclear development. Among those designated are the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran and several affiliated companies. Meanwhile, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says he hopes the outcome from the weekend's negotiations will be a peaceful one.
I mean, President Trump's been clear on that. Iran should not have a nuclear bomb, nuclear weapons. We very much hope president is focused on doing that peacefully. That's very much what we would prefer as well. Our job at the Defense Department is to make sure we have all the assets available for any possible contingency.
Hegseth confirms the deployment of B-2 bombers to the US-British base on the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia. Experts say the stealthy B-2s, capable of carrying the heaviest bombs and nuclear weapons, are now in a strategic position for operations in the Middle East. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian reiterated on Wednesday that Iran is not after a nuclear bomb and expressed openness to US investment if a nuclear agreement can be reached.
In our Inside Politics talk show, we discuss the recent escalation between the United States and Iran and how important the upcoming talks in Oman are for the Gulf countries. Alex Vatanka is a Middle East specialist in Washington, D.C., and he says diplomatic talks in Oman will be crucial to stabilize regional security.
One thing I say about Oman has a very long track record in working as an independent and respected mediator, going back 20 years plus. I mean, you can go back to the Iran-Iraq war when officials would meet in Muscat. So Oman has a long track history here. It's done this, they're respected, they're trusted. The issue of trust is really important. Other countries have offered their services, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. But the Iranians trust Oman is the most in this case, and that's why these meetings are happening in Muscat. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a bigger dynamic happening in the region. I think the bigger dynamic has already happened for some time now. That dynamic started changing in 2019 with the Emiratis and the Saudis realizing that they didn't want to be in conflict with Iran. We saw them pull out of the war in Yemen. Basically, what you have in the region is a number of Arab countries in the Gulf, particularly the Saudis, the Emiratis. They're focused on economic development. And they realize they cannot afford to sit next to an Iran that throws rocks and missiles and drones at them, because that undermines economic confidence and undermines their plans. So I think there is a regional shift away from confronting Iran, certainly in the part of the Gulf states, and trying to coexist with Iran. And that's why they're so careful in what they say, and they're so worried about potential of war, because they consider themselves frontline states, right? If Iran and the United States end up in a military conflict, you just have to take the words of the Iranian general from the Revolutionary Guards, who just said about a week ago that there are 50,000 American troops in 10 bases that we would target. Guess where those bases are located? They're mostly located in the Gulf countries. That's not a good place for them to be. So they're trying to also do their part to make what contribution they can make to get America and Iran to reach a deal. And we all have to hope that Israel also gets what it wants. And again, those of us who hope diplomacy will work are looking at these factors and seeing if a deal will be possible.
Over in Germany, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats reached a coalition agreement with Christian Democratic Union's Friedrich Merz, set to become the next Chancellor. Presenting the policies of the future government in Berlin, Merz said that Germany will shape the world amid turbulences caused by US President Donald Trump. Saying that Europe can count on Germany, he announced that the coalition would reform and invest to keep the country stable, make it safer and economically stronger.
Gerade in dieser Woche haben Entscheidungen der amerikanischen Regierungen
just this week, decisions by the U.S. administration caused new turbulences. We can actually watch the reactions in real time. We do not yet know what direction the international situation will head, but that's why our message today is all the more clear. We want to and we will help shape the shift in the world for Germany.
für Deutschland mitgestalten.
Ukraine's military chief Alexander Syrsky says that Russia has launched a new offensive on the northeast of the country. In an interview for Ukrainian LB, Syrsky noted that a large increase in assaults was already being observed. He supported claims of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had earlier warned that Russia was preparing an offensive on the two regions of Kharkiv and Sumy, saying the offensive has already begun.
95% території Ірпеня знаходяться під нашим.
The United States and Panama have announced new steps to expand military cooperation. During a visit by the US Defense Secretary on Wednesday, both sides addressed growing concerns over security and influence around the Panama Canal.
The United States and Panama say they'll expand US military training in the Central American nation. Panama says the US has recognized sovereignty over the Panama Canal, despite tough rhetoric from Washington. It follows the first visit of a Pentagon chief, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, to Panama in decades. Hegseth says he sees the canal as key terrain that Panama would secure together with the US and not with China.
We certainly understand that the Panama Canal is in Panama, and protecting Panamanian sovereignty from malign influence is important, which is why when President Trump says we're taking back the Panama Canal from Chinese influence, that involves partnership with the United States and Panama. And we're grateful that they've welcomed U.S. troops on Panamanian soil by invitation through rotational joint exercises. And that's what you'll see in the Memorandum of Understanding, is an opportunity to revive, whether it's the military base, naval air station, locations where U.S. troops can work with Panamanian troops to enhance capabilities.
However, in joint statements about deepening security cooperation, the English language version published by the Pentagon didn't include a sentence that was in the Spanish language version published by Panama that spoke about the country's sovereignty over the canal. Panama's Minister of Public Security, Frank Abrego, made it clear that at no point did the recent Memorandum of Understanding involve giving up sovereignty over the Panama Canal or its adjacent areas. He says that Panama remains under the framework of the canal's neutrality treaty.
Panama has, at no moment in this Memorandum of Understanding, ceded sovereignty over the Panama Canal or any of its adjacent areas. Panama is within the neutrality treaty, and upon this constitutional base, the US has acted with due respect.
He also added that Panama would not allow permanent military bases. This visit marks a renewed phase in US-Panama defense cooperation, with both governments reiterating their positions on sovereignty and security around the Panama Canal.
The Azerbaijani Defense Ministry says that its military positions were subjected to fire from the direction of Gorus on Wednesday evening. According to the ministry, between 7:25 and 7:35 p.m. on the 9th of April, Armenian forces opened fire from positions near the Kaznavar and Kanazak areas in Armenia's Gorus region. Azerbaijan officials say its troops responded with what they say were adequate retaliatory measures to neutralize the threat. No casualties have been reported so far, and the situation is set to be under control. Azerbaijan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has extended its condolences to the Dominican Republic after a roof collapse at a nightclub in Santo Domingo on Tuesday night. At least 184 people were killed and there were more than 150 injured. In a statement shared on social media, Baku authorities expressed sympathy to the government and the people and wished a swift recovery to those injured. Emergency crews say they'll continue to work until the last body is found. The incident prompted international messages of support. The European Union has authorised the European Commission to begin negotiations with Kazakhstan on easing visa requirements. The talks will aim to simplify procedures, including faster processing, fewer documents, lower fees and broader access to multi-entry and long-term visas. Kazakhstan's foreign ministry says the agreement will take effect only after both sides complete necessary domestic procedures. The move is also expected to boost cooperation in trade, culture and humanitarian efforts. The UN has urged the Trump administration to reconsider its recent cuts to humanitarian aid, warning that such reductions could amount to a death sentence for millions of people in desperate need. Afghanistan, which is already grappling with a severe humanitarian crisis, is expected to be among the hardest hit by these cuts. Tamim Bahis brings more from Kabul.
The Trump administration has cut funding to the World Food Programme's emergency operations, which support millions of people in impoverished countries around the world, including Afghanistan. In a social media post, the WFP, the world's largest provider of food aid, urged the United States to reverse the decision, warning that cuts could amount to a death sentence for millions facing extreme hunger and starvation. Afghanistan is currently grappling with a severe humanitarian crisis. According to the United Nations, nearly 23 million people in the country will require humanitarian assistance this year. WFP Acting Country Director Mutinta Chimuka has stressed that Afghanistan is currently experiencing the worst child malnutrition crisis in its history. This year alone, 3.5 million children are expected to suffer from malnutrition. Every 10 seconds, another child is affected. Even the mothers tasked with nourishing the next generation are themselves malnourished. The Associated Press reports that current and former USAID officials and partners say around $560 million in humanitarian aid to Afghanistan has been cut. The funding loss has impacted vital services, including emergency food aid, care for severely malnourished infants, essential medical treatment, clean drinking water, and urgent mental health support for survivors of physical violence. While the de facto Afghan authorities have yet to comment on the recent cuts, this comes at a time when the need on the ground are growing and the world's most vulnerable face an increasingly uncertain future. This is Tamim Bahis in Kabul for A News.
You're up to date with world news for the hour. Stay with us for more updates on the hour.